So hi, my name's Jervis Johnson. I worked at Games Workshop for 30-40 years. One of the first games that I worked on was this game, Blood Bowl, and the person I worked on it with primarily was this chap.
Me, Marc Gascoigne. I joined Games Workshop for the first of two times in 1984, working on first the Judge Dredd roleplay game. But they told me that a guy in sales was working on a board game of his own.
Which was Blood Bowl. And that's how we got to meet up. So
how did you join Games Workshop then?
Well, I worked in a game shop originally, and I got to know Ian Livingstone and Steve Jackson and other people who worked at Games Workshop, including a chap with the wonderful name of Peter Darvel-Evans. And I was at a games day, and he said he was looking for a trade sales assistant to help him out, and would I like the job? So I said yes, I would. I joined Games Workshop in the sales department, spent a year or two there, and as part of that, Brian Ansell, who ran the company at the time, came along, and he was saying we could do some more board games, basically, if you've got any ideas. And I was saying, well, it would be nice to have some little games, and I came up with 2 or 3 ideas, and one of them was this idea of a game based on American football, but with orcs and goblins and monsters and things fighting it. So kind of like a spoof game like that, really. And I expected Brian to say, yeah, those sound like good ideas, I'll get the people in the design studio to design them. Instead he turned around to me and said, I like that third idea that you came up with, can you go away and design it yourself? So I basically went off and did the first prototype for Blood Bowl in my own time, in my little flat. Never having really designed a game before, but I came up with a basic idea, and then people said, well, this looks interesting, might have legs, and they put me together with Marc, who basically started to take what I'd done and batter it into shape, because I got no experience of writing rules and things like that, and Marc had quite a lot by this time.
Well, which is weird. Yeah, I was hired at the age of 21 to work on the Dredd role-playing game just because I'd run a fanzine that had taken the piss out of Ian Livingstone and Steve Jackson. These days, he pretends that he hired me in to shut me up, really, and there's obviously get him on the right side. But being a fantasy gamer, you design your own scenarios, and we went that a stage further and published them in a magazine. Got bored of that and started just writing silly stuff, all very adolescent. But we got hired as young bucks, as myself and a guy called Ian Marsh, who ended up as White Dwarf editor in the glory days when White Dwarf was a role-play magazine. Glory days for role players, not so much for sort of miniatures fans. And I didn't know what I was doing, but I'm quite bright, and surrounded by great people, particularly Albie Fiore, who at the time was the head of games development in Sunbeam Road in London Games Workshop. He's no longer with us, alas. But he was working on Talisman, the revised edition of Railway Rivals, a whole bunch of other stuff. He'd also worked on the previous range of Games Workshop games like Warlock and the Doctor Who game, Valley of the Four Winds, and all those first glimmerings of what became Games Workshop as a full-on games design studio. And the other thing we should say is Ian and myself, and I know Jervis did similar, on Sunday afternoons would gather at people's houses and turn to Channel 4, where they were showing this amazing new thing from the States, American football. Now, not that American football was new, but the coverage over here suddenly kicked in the mid-80s on Channel 4 on Sunday afternoons. And for people of a certain bent, and I think game players and board gamers were of that kind, it was a bit of it's like rugby, but with puzzle rules, with these extra bits of first down, second downs, and so on. And we were absolutely fascinated by those.
Yeah.
As we said, the same, I believe, couldn't be shared by Brian, who didn't have a television. And for a long time, he was like, I don't get the appeal of this, and it sounds fun, and the fantasy stuff's good, but could it be based on something else? He was very much persuaded, of course, by the fact that everyone else in the design studio...
It did quite well, I think. That was the thing. But to start off with, we were pretty much left to our own devices, really. I think, it's interesting what Marc was saying, because I'd, in my teen years, I'd played some American football games, because I was into American football, and my best gaming.
You mean buddy. Board games, not actually carrying the kids?
No, this was board games rather than actually playing American football. But no, my friend Lewis was into American football too, and so we played games like Football Strategy. I particularly remember, which was a great little game. Still is, actually. It is a great great game. And Lewis, who was, went on to do IT stuff, but this was in the very early days of IT. He'd got a little home computer, and he computerized football strategy.
Wow.
And we used to play that and things. So I'd had some kind of experience playing games based on American football, and I knew that that it suited board gaming, basically. So I think that was probably in the back of my head when I came up with the idea for Blood Bowl.
Well, that's an interesting point, isn't it? Because American football, because of its downs and its attempts, it's turn-based. And you could see the structure in it, trying to replicate soccer or rugby or whatever would be much harder to do, because it's a free-flowing carnage. Though, of course, you added that to Blood Bowl.
Well, yes, I took that, and I think that, I mean, you can see with the first edition, which is basically what we've got here. So, in my mind, there are probably about sort of 3, maybe 4 editions. I think people, particularly aficionados of Blood Bowl, will kind of like subdivide them up into various different ones. But the first edition was this one, and the game that I came up with was basically the Warhammer rules, with an innocent little football stuck in the middle and played on a board, and so it made it really quite war game like.
Yeah.
So it was very violent. Generally, the teams would kind of like meet in the middle, beat each other up quite a lot, and in the end, there'd be a few players left, and you could try and score some touchdowns.
Tremendous fun.
It was. I think the basic gameplay was obviously good enough to get people involved, but I think when I did the first draft, I think I put a little bit of humour in, because I was particularly, and I should have brought my copy of the book along. There was a book called Lord of the Rings, which is a satire of Lord of the Rings, which appealed to me because I've got a rather puerile sense of humour in general.
Well, it's a very funny book, and there's a joke every 3 lines. It's
a great
equivalent
book.
of A Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, but for Lord of the Rings.
Yeah, it was sort of Terry Pratchett-like as well, but it was good. And so I kind of like, I'd got that in my head. So the first teams had some silly little bits of humour in there, but I hadn't done very much with it. The rules were fairly badly written because I didn't really know what I was doing, and the background was very, very basic. So then Marc got involved, and Ali Morrison as well.
Yeah.
Basically, and then things started to go from there.
Yeah, it was like it just found its champions. People are excited by it, volunteered to work on it to some extent. Stu Parkinson, who was one of your colleagues in sales, wrote the initial draft of the Blood Bowl history of Nuffle. And
he did actually play American football as well. That was the other thing.
Okay.
He actually played American football as a running back.
Did that,
like that
sudden influx of realism affect the game in any way?
No.
But he was super keen, obviously, and as we said, people were just volunteering. I'd become friendly with Ali because in the first Nottingham design studio, there were a few of us used to get in super early and then sneak off quite early. And so Ali and I would sit and just talk about Blood Bowl and American football on a Monday morning. Yeah. And slowly but surely, we were there plotting away, adding all sorts of things to this game that Jervis didn't know about until they turned up. But my job, as a game developer, really, and an editor, and project manager, was to just turn Jervis's genius idea into something that was a little more formalised and obviously could be understood, and then for Charlie Elliott to lay out and turn into a game that people could play over and over. Yeah. But very quickly, our passion joined the basic idea, and Jervis's jokes became permission to do more jokes, really, I think.
Yeah.
So all the teams had to have names. When Stu wrote the original, the history of the Blood Bowl, and terms like Nuffle and Bloodwiser and things like that became part of the language of it very quickly. It became a license to do something that was very much its own thing.
Yeah.
I have to say, Warhammer itself at the time had this deep vestigial layer of punning.
That's true.
And one of the things I remember as we arrived in because Jervis and I both relocated from the London role-play games workshop to the miniature-based Nottingham Games Workshop when that happened in '86. One of the first tasks you were always given, because everyone had run out of ideas, was, we've got this box of 48 new halflings. Can you name them all? Right. And you'd have to come up with 48 not completely horrible, groan-worthy punning names for them. And some of them were just weren't jokes at all. But that spirit was very much underlying Warhammer at the time.
Yeah.
For all that it's grim and dark, there's also that twinkle in the eye.
Yeah.
And Blood Bowl just took it and ran off with it, heading for the touchline.
It did. It went further, I think, than Warhammer had gone at that stage. But I mean, all of us had got similar influences. Yeah, the same books, the same comics. 2000 AD was a big influence and stuff like that. Books like Lord of the Rings, obviously, but also Dune. But there was, I think, at that time, that quite sort of like almost satirical kind of edge, and I think that's where Blood Bowl, the humour started to kind of like morph into like a kind of like a satire of particularly American football, but sports in general, professional sports in general. And I think that's where Marc added a lot of stuff in. He came up with the idea of the Did You Knows, and Jim and Bob doing the examples of play and stuff like that. I can remember you going off and getting American football magazines and Smiths and bringing them back.
It's got to look like this. Well, that's why there are stars and strap lines and things like that in the design, because we were copying what we'd seen on the razzmatazz of American football. It's one of the reasons why on the telly it looked so alien, because it wasn't, here's a bloke in a sheepskin coat at Ellen Road or whatever, leads on a 0-0 draw with Rotherham of soccer, if you're not particularly into it, which I wasn't. I was too busy playing role-play games on a Saturday afternoon. American football was this garish, all-American cheerleader kind of razzmatazz. And building that in meant there was lots of opportunities to do slightly weird things. But also some of it practical. When you're doing examples of play, they can be a bit tedious. All right, here's a complicated rule. We're now going to explain it in great detail, which when you're first reading rules, you don't even want to read. But you add a personality to it, and it becomes both informative but also interesting, and you're prepared to read them. And the Did You Knows came off football cards and trading cards and things like, oh, here's blah de blah, here's the fridge, the fact is he's done this and he's done this, and here's a little trivia thing, he can bench press an entire bison or something.
It's got the stats. Which was a big American football thing.
They're mad on stats, aren't they?
Absolutely, they love them, and so that started to kind of like come in like, but in Blood Bowl it's like the most decapitations or something like that, like whatever it might be.
Well, it's a pity we never did a Top Trumps knockoff with Blood Bowl for characters actually. Indeed, possibly someone else's product. But
did we ever do a Blood Bowl? I'm just wondering whether we did. No, there was the card. I forgot what they were called now. The cards that were like Top Trump cards that Games Workshop did.
They did the combat cards first.
Combat cards, yes.
We might have done some Blood Bowl ones because that was.
Perhaps we did.
That's an intro. I'm going to go off at a tangent here, but the combat cards was. We used to work on a bit of Nottingham called Low Pavement, was where the studio was, which was right in the middle of town. So at lunchtime you'd go off and you'd wander about, and there was a toy shop. I think in the Victoria Centre nearby, and I can remember wandering around, and there was a rack of Top Trumps. And I think it was like lorries and tractors. And I can remember looking at it thinking, my God, if they can sell Top Trumps about lorries and tractors, surely we could do something very similar. So I bought one of them and I went back and I said, look, we could do something like this, except we stick pictures of toy soldiers on the cards and we just put some numbers down at the bottom. There's got to be more exciting than that. And again, it was one of those things where people go, I'm really not sure about that. We did one set and it just sold incredibly well because it was pictures of toy soldiers primarily. It was just a good excuse to do those. And I think we might have done a Blood Bowl one, but I really can't remember whether we did or we didn't.
Do write in. Let us know below the line. That we've forgotten this and you've remembered
if we did do it, somebody will have it somewhere or another.
That's the price on eBay.
I digress.
Well, not at all. I think all that fascination with the surrounding world of Blood Bowl, and I've always been fascinated by the fact that it became its own thing. And then, of course, we started having debates about whether it was in Warhammer or wasn't, because we were certainly borrowing bits of Warhammer. The Reichland Reavers are named after where the Empire is and things like that. But at the same time, they were doing stuff with
hanging out with orcs and things.
But also they were summoning vehicles from the 20th century and spaceships and chainsaws and all sorts of stuff was creeping in.
I think that so at the time that Blood Bowl came out, Warhammer hadn't got that kind of like real solid hold on Games Workshop. I mean now Games Workshop stores are called Warhammer stores. But back then, I mean, the company did all kinds of stuff. We'd got Talisman, we'd got Hero Quest, all kinds of bits
Dark Future was coming through. There was still plenty of board games, but also role-play games were still being made. A lot of the Stormbringer and Hawkmoon and Middle-earth role-play, RuneQuest, all those things, all coming through the Workshop engine.
So Yeah, with Blood Bowl, it didn't matter that it was kind of like it's a weird, because I think the other thing it satirised wasn't just sport; it was fantasy stuff.
Yeah,
and to an extent, Warhammer. Actually, it made fun of our own stuff. And
we played to the cliches. The elves were poncy, snooty gits, and the halflings were rubbish and enjoyed a good dinner, and all the classic tropes were in
we
it.
exaggerated them again, didn't we, basically, so they became more extreme. And then, so the undead team were very Hammer horror, kind of like extreme kind of version of that. But then they were quite like that in the early version of Warhammer as well.
And there were vampires and werewolves, and if you've got a vampire, of course, he's got a cloak and talks like Christopher Lee. You have no option.
Yeah,
and I think like Marc had said, like as you'd already put those kind of jokes in, it kind of just felt natural to continue it anyway. So.
Yeah, and then as time went along, so when we got to the third edition, which isn't, sort of like it was a decade or more in the future. No, actually not that far in the future.
No, not quite.
Like 5 or 6 years. Anyway, it lay in the future. The background, I was asked to change the background to actually set it in the Warhammer world, which I did, but it never felt quite right to me. I preferred the background.
Why was that? Did it add a dose of realism almost, or it had to make more sense, or was it?
Well, it had to make more sense. So you had to have kind of, it had to make more sense, but also made no sense at all to me, because clearly you couldn't have Blood Bowl teams wandering around the Warhammer world playing Blood Bowl. It just made no sense at all.
Being filmed by demons and broadcast magically into people's houses.
Yeah, exactly. A lot of that stuff kind of went away, so it became more of they were kind of almost like a travelling circus in the third edition, kind of like they would turn up in a town and entertain people. So it was more of a carnival kind of like thing that went on. So some of the stuff that was very kind of anachronistic in the first and second edition went away. But it was obviously, it wasn't the Warhammer world, and I think people quickly realised that actually no, they're really not playing Blood Bowl. So we ended up with kind of like Blood Bowl World 1 from the first and second edition, then the Blood Bowl World 2, and then really later on Blood Bowl World 3. And the latest version of the game really goes back pretty much to more of the original background, which I think is a good thing, to be perfectly honest.
So it still has elements of Warhammer and recognisable character archetypes in it, but it's not in Middenheim in 1232 or whatever.
Exactly that. It doesn't try to say actually there are Blood Bowl teams in the Warhammer world, and you can add them to your army. I think there's one bit where we can be able to add Blood Bowl players to your Warhammer army and stuff. So
that was one of the things why Blood Bowl kept going, I think, because it was selling toy soldiers and the metal teams particularly. And we started with the card standees, the original one.
So I don't know. I might as well get some of these bits and pieces out. So the original version of the game, there were no miniatures. What you got were these. So this is all. I was
shocked. I opened this morning, and one shocked to find it's mostly unpunched. So check out my eBay listings later. But also how flimsy these buggers are.
Yeah, they are very.
And obviously they're going into the cards. The sort of slotter-based standee things here.
I'll get some photos of everything.
Totally.
So you'd.
What the hell?
Put your little guy. There you go. So that's a little halfling. But
well, let's also talk about this fella, just quickly.
So this model here, which I'm sure there'll be close-ups of. Now, is the first scratch-built 3D Blood Bowl miniature there ever was. As I remember, it was Dave Andrews who made it and painted it, as almost like a proof of concept, basically, because we did this game, and really Blood Bowl was seen as fitting in with the board game range, so it was more akin to Talisman and stuff like that, and so the cardboard standees was very traditional. And it came out of that
bit of the design studio.
Yeah, but it proved popular, and so popular, in fact, that it was pretty obvious that we'd need to make miniatures for it. I think it caught everybody out. So I think for me and Ali and Stu and stuff like that, we thought, well, this is kind of cool, but even we didn't really anticipate it to kind of like catching on quite the way that it did. So the first edition came out and really just sold incredibly well. It was, and we had to do Death Zone, this expansion, from a standing start pretty much within about 6 months. It was just rushed out, and then the second edition with the big polystyrene pitch and things, which had plastic miniatures in, came pretty soon after that, because the idea was actually, no, this is almost like a core game system that we've got here.
For those who don't know, what did Death Zone add?
It added more teams and...
Let's show you the exciting context. So yes, it's more teams, extra rules, an expanded character roster,
Yeah,
but
so you can
it's
see-
basically loads of extra bits. So there's more halflings, there's a Slan team in there I can see, there's a Norse team, some Empire and Bretonnian Knights, I think, by the looks of it, and a bunch of others.
There was the referee, wasn't there? I remember
Ah,
the
yes.
referee special character. And
Thrud is in that,
yes, Thrud the Barbarian.
and so on and so forth. But more of the same. It didn't drastically change it. So we're going to be Pete Nion art. So Pete starts to come on board doing more of the artwork,
Yeah,
joining Ali,
yeah.
who actually had a day job, bless him, making brilliant miniatures. Werewolves. And of course, Jervis always taking the opportunity to big up his own game by writing copious design notes.
Copious.
Yes.
You can exaggerate. So it's got one of my nice early, probably the first photograph there. Is that?
I'm trying to be cool.
Yeah, it's a picture of me as I looked way back then. Again, I'm sure you'll get the opportunity to take some
Indeed,
pictures
yes.
of that.
We can still Photoshop the hair on it.
So it caught on, and we kind of like went from there. There was a team in White Dwarf.
Yep.
So you got a free Skaven team in White Dwarf magazine as a little insert because it was cardboard.
So again, that coverage took a while. It wasn't like Warhammer Fantasy roleplay where every month there was new rules. Here's the location. Here's some character archetypes. Here's new spells. It was because there's only so much you can add to it.
Yeah.
But it never quite stopped and faded out the way that other board games would come out. People play them, go, yeah, that's cool, and put it on the shelf. But Blood Bowl, because it invites you to get the lads around the table on a Sunday afternoon and replicate the Channel 4 coverage, there's always a need to have more and more bits for it.
Yeah, well, I think that the thing that it took me, wasn't until years later that I realised what we'd kind of done here, because I think what a lot of the appeal and the success of Blood Bowl is because what it does is it takes kind of like the tightness of rules writing that you can get with a board game. Squares help a lot, for example. They're limited numbers of models and things. And then it combines it with the aspect of kind of army building that you get in the Warhammer and 40k hobby propler. So the team rosters are basically like little tiny army lists. And you got to pick your team and then name it. And then later on, once you stop doing the cardboard standees, paint it. And so it became unique. Nobody else had a team like that, and that's like collecting an army for Warhammer.
Yeah.
It had that appeal, and a lot of the board games didn't do that. The board game, it was a thing in its own right. You got it, you played it. It might get expansions and things, but until relatively recently, with kind of like like getting things where you've got legacy games.
Yeah.
The idea that your board game would change and morph over time, and nobody else's version of it was quite the same as yours, wasn't really something that was around.
So it is more Warhammer on a board and less standard traditional board game.
It was a fusion of the two things, I think, and that's what made it kind of unique, and that's what I think kept it going, because in between games you could be thinking about your team. I mean, obviously it had league rules and stuff, and it lent itself very well to that, but you had that whole aspect of like there's a name for it that I can't think exactly what it is now, but basically the thing that you do in between playing games when you're thinking about it and planning what you're going to do next, it gave you quite a lot of hobby within that package. But what it did was it tightened it up a little bit. So there are people who play Warhammer and 40k who play Blood Bowl too, but in general, people who play Blood Bowl are Blood Bowl players. That's their hobby. But it's got enough kind of breadth and thing for it to be a complete hobby in its own right, in the same way that Warhammer and 40k are.
And on the business side, because it mirrors the collecting of miniatures, the painting and modelling and imagineering of miniatures, and then playing games with your own assembled army of the miniatures. It's exactly the same as Warhammer in that sense. So it makes sense for Games Workshop to keep it in print, and even now. And it's survived where there are no other games other than Warhammer and 40k from those times that are still
Talisman's still around, I suppose, but licensed out now. So you do get some, but I mean, Blood Bowl was one of those games that basically has stood the test of time one way or another. And obviously it did go off sale. I mean, there were lots of say that I think that.
Well, let's talk. Perhaps we should talk through how it developed. So you mentioned in passing earlier that after the card standees, there were miniatures for teams and individual teams, and a bit of White Dwarf coverage and the expansion and so But then after that, the second edition. What was the big change from this to the big box edition?
Yeah, so I think that at the time that we'd got to that stage where we were thinking of these big box games with miniatures in that gave you everything, and it was decided to. I mean, Brian said, "No, we should do one like this for Blood Bowl. It's popular. I don't understand it, but it's popular, and it needs a miniatures range to go with it, basically. So we can do players plastic frame in the box of players. Back in those days, it was very early days for Games Workshop doing plastic miniatures. So I think you just got pretty much one. You got two frames. But the player was the same, colours, so we had to use the different coloured little rings on the bases, so you could pick out your blitzers and your throwers and so on. That was how the players were differentiated.
And you also had the legendary polystyrene board. The
polystyrene pitch, yes, yeah. So it came out just after I think we'd done Mighty Fortress first, which was a castle made out of expanded polystyrene that could be put together for your games of Warhammer, so the pitch was this almost 3D polystyrene pitch in 3 parts that kind of like attached together. Unfortunately, what we didn't really realise at the time was that polystyrene, the machine that makes it is designed to make industrial packaging, and so it shoots the polystyrene out at quite high force, kind of blasts these things out, and you get quite a lot of damage. Now, that doesn't matter if you're going to be putting a stereo system inside, as long as it fits and it goes into the box. But if it's your Blood Bowl pitch and it's got a huge dent in it,
corners are missing.
So wastage was extremely high for Mighty Fortress and on Blood Bowl, which is why it got quietly dropped. I think after Blood Bowl came out, that was the last time.
Taking
the
them back
Blood
to the
Bowl
shops.
pitches in particular suffered really badly with dents in the corners and stuff.
It's a pity because it looks amazing.
It looks great.
Suddenly you've got your own stadium and everything, and of course people then started scratch building, stands and cheerleaders and all sorts of stuff to go around.
That's right. Yeah, you got lots of extra little bits of hobby, and we'd lent into that to an extent. You had coaching staff and things, and cheerleaders. You get some amazing stadiums. That
and how did the rules change then? Which obviously.
Well, I think they changed a little bit. I think it's I made them more specific. So this first edition really is the Warhammer rules. It's got it's literally the Warhammer rules.
It's even got the same stats. Look at
exactly.
these.
It's got the same profiles and
Constitution.
stats. What it had tagged on was rules for catching a ball, for running the league and things like that. So we expanded on the Warhammer rules and did a variant of them. The second edition Blood Bowl, it had its own bespoke game system. So it didn't use the Warhammer rules anymore. But what it kept was a lot of the kind of attritional aspects of the game. So it's still pretty much
still fighting, and then whoever's left runs for the line.
And it's still in the first and the second edition of the game, I couldn't figure out a way to get to have the game split into halves, and to have a set number of turns. So the way that the game was won, it was the first team to score 3 touchdowns won the match, so that you didn't have to try and track turns and things. So I couldn't figure out how to do that. In the third edition, which is pretty much the current version of the game, the turnover rule came in, and that allowed the game to include a turn track and stuff like that. But that wasn't available back then. So what it had was its own bespoke system, but the gameplay remained fairly true to the first edition. So it tended to be pretty much a line of people fighting in the middle, and then occasionally somebody breaking off and trying to score a touchdown. But it had the league rules and effectively a campaign system kind of like included in there. It very quickly got a couple of expansion books, which expanded on those things and added, a bit like Death Zone, it kind of like added extra, almost entirely unplay-tested kind of extra stuff onto the game system. And I think you were around for the start of the project and then moved on.
I got fired with extreme prejudice, yes. I was quite obnoxious. I went off and did other things.
Yeah.
And by the time I returned 10 years later, Blood Bowl was a solid part of the landscape.
Yeah.
Which meant that eventually, we ended up doing Blood Bowl comics, or proposing Blood Bowl comics that eventually turned up. As I was leaving, I had a bunch of freelance projects, and one of which was scripting an as yet unpublished and probably never will be Blood Bowl, early Blood Bowl comic to be drawn by Pete Nion, who'd become the absolute core, the extra missing ingredient, I think, to give the real spark. Again, someone who's very au fait with American pop culture and the things he's satirising.
Yeah. No, absolutely. No, Pete was a vital addition for second edition, and arguably the most important bit about it, to be perfectly honest. There was so much stuff in there that the look of the game was almost entirely down to Pete, and he added in lots of great little visual jokes and stuff.
He's one of those guys, because he's from a cartooning background and a 2000 AD style background. He would write things everywhere, so there are puns on everything. Everyone wore a T-shirt with something on, and it all just added and added and added to this world and made it living and breathing and funny.
No, absolutely, and so I think that in many ways that second edition, for me, it's my favourite version in terms of the look and the artwork and the background and the satire within it. I think it was a great version and really achieved what I'd kind of vaguely got in my mind, and I think which we ended up trying to push in the first edition, it reached its fruition in the second edition. I mean, the third edition, so the gameplay is a lot better and the background's perfectly fine, but actually for me, I preferred what we'd done in the second edition version of the game and the two books that came out alongside it. Basically, they were good fun.
So where's the game at now? Because obviously, as you've implied, that the third edition has kept on going and all the version, as it were. But I know there's been the Living Rulebook edition, and it's still in a place where people contribute to it.
Well, absolutely. Well, I think it's important to remember that Blood Bowl wasn't available for a good chunk of time, so it was a long time. So the the second edition was out, and we decided to do a third edition. Again, it was as much to do with packaging and stuff like that. And by that stage, we'd got Warhammer and 40k with the core game systems, and there was this idea that we'd have secondary game systems that would sit alongside those. And Blood Bowl was really one of those with the third edition. But at that time, I'd got a lot more experience as a games designer, and I think that I actually designed a game that's pretty good with third edition. So the gameplay really stood up, and there was a lot of play testing put into the game in the studio, and so the game came out, and it really, I think, cemented Blood Bowl's place. Then it was a great game. People loved it. They loved the background and the stories that were there. But within Games Workshop, it was again, it's still, people didn't really understand it. The company was moving. It had kind of pivoted a bit, really, to become a miniatures company primarily. And so when Blood Bowl came out, it caused a little bit of trouble in some of our stores because it was very, very popular. And there was this story going around that it was too easy to sell. So it was too easy to sell people Blood Bowl. You could.
It's a good problem to have.
You think?
You would think, but there was a feeling that Blood Bowl team's only like 14, 16 kind of models. Whereas a Warhammer or a 40k army is 2, 3, 4 times the size of that. So it was perceived, well, this could be dangerous, actually. What could happen is that people will play Blood Bowl and they won't, instead of Warhammer and 40k, and they won't sell miniatures. We're a miniatures company. So what kind of followed on from that was the staff were told not to sell Blood Bowl too hard in the stores, and it got kind of retired and dropped out of the range, seen as being a threat. Now, again, personally, I was biased, but I didn't see that, because to me, Blood Bowl appealed to a different group of people who weren't going to collect Warhammer 40k armies anyway. And with Blood Bowl, you might not collect a big army, but what you do is you collect lots of teams if you're really into the game. If you've got that little collecting gene, you do it. So I think it was. I didn't need to be done, but it meant that Blood Bowl got retired for a while, but it was still very popular, and the community kept it alive.
Okay.
Yeah, and then when I got to set up Fanatic, came back.
The kind of in-house home for all these secondary games.
That's right. That's right. We could, because a lot of the other secondary game systems, Necromunda, Blood Bowl, or the Epic Scales, and Wartime, things like this, they'd got their own little dedicated hobby communities who wanted more stuff, but our strategy wasn't to support it. So in the end, Fnatic was set up to try and provide support on a shoestring, and one of the most important games in that range was Blood Bowl. I managed to annoy the community by doing like what I called a 4th edition, which had got some not terribly well thought through modifications to the system and ended up having to backtrack and reset it. But
well, that was very big of you, though. Not every game designer does that.
I guess, but I think...
Albeit D&D 4th edition.
Yeah, it was,
it
was hubris on my part, it really was, yeah. But
actually, it sounds like the community were a part of, well, the lifeblood of keeping it going, and then you were able to allow them a voice, a seat at the table, as it were, to join and collaborate.
Absolutely. So the way that Fnatic was set up, we've got so few staff that I had to rely on out-of-house playtesters and people, and there were a good group of them, for Blood Bowl. So which became the Blood Bowl Rules Committee in time, and then out of that. I knew that Blood Bowl wouldn't necessarily stay around forever in the game. What I wanted was there to be a proper, community support, and that became the NAF, which I helped set up by effectively writing a constitution, which meant that it was a non-profit organisation that had a kind of a yearly election to pick people, because I knew from that would give it a robustness, that kind of democracy. Although it would create internal politics within the NAF, it meant that it would be very robust and would keep on going from year to year, and indeed it has, basically. So the community became involved and have done a huge amount to keep the game going. And then Fnatic ended up getting shut down. Blood Bowl disappeared for a bit, but then the Specialist Games studio, part of Forge World, basically, did a new edition of Blood Bowl and kept it going, basically, because it's been very popular for them. Exactly. And again,
I remember when Workshop were, because I rejoined Workshop, ran Black Library and built that into a thing for 10 years, and then we started bringing back things like Talisman and so on. When I left, they were all licensed out, but I know Blood Bowl was never up for discussion for licensing out, although the people like Fantasy Flight picking up Talisman and Warhammer 40k roleplay and Wolfrup and things like that, they were keen to have Blood Bowl more than anything. But I think people had understood that it was a Games Workshop game and would stay there. It's just finding the way to make it work.
Yeah, absolutely.
With Forge World becoming the Specialist Games studio that does the high-powered limited edition and short-run stuff.
Yeah.
Blood Bowl seems like a natural home for it.
Yeah, absolutely, and they've done great stuff with it. The latest version of the rules is super. I mean, it's very, very similar to 3rd edition, really. The game hasn't changed terribly much because I think it hangs together okay. I mean, it's interesting looking at it with a modern games design as view, because it's from the early 90s, and if you're into your board games and stuff like that, then there's lots of stuff that's been done. So I think you'd do it differently, but then it doesn't need to be done differently because it works.
Yeah, it works.
And so why would you change it? It's just been something that's, I think it's been sort of like a high point of certainly my career. And I think yours too, really, Mark, being involved.
I've done a few things, but yes, I still love saying, oh yes, I did the jokes in Blood Bowl. As one of the summaries of my early years, my first time at Workshop. And I love the fact, actually, that this game has passed to the people, as it were, and they've kept it going. It seems to me that even if it hadn't come back, there's still begun to be people out in the Midwest or in Italy or wherever fanatically playing. It's why it was called Fanatic Games, I suspect, because it was the people who couldn't stop themselves. And it lives and breathes. People run their own leagues, people run their own, they run the NAF for you. Or for the game now.
Well, they organise the World Cup. I mean, once every 4 years. I mean, I think they'll expect to get like 2,000 coaches.
And it's a rare hobby game that goes into the hands of people who will just keep it going forever. They don't care, but in sufficient numbers and with sufficient passion that it keeps them going. It's a wonderful thing that the Blood Bowl fans do. I think.
Yeah, no, for sure.
Couldn't see too much of that anywhere else. Which also implies that it's not really your game anymore. And you mentioned obviously that Forge World are doing it, and I guess you've not been involved.
No, I wasn't involved in the latest version. They did ask me, but I said, look, you really don't want me kind of like saying, well, I wouldn't do it like that if I were you, really, because
Just coming in and being annoying.
Yeah, I mean, I think that obviously I was working at Games Workshop when I designed Blood Bowl, and so it's one of those things where it's kind of a professional piece of work. It's owned by Games Workshop. It's not mine, and there comes a stage where you have to hand the baton on.
Yeah.
You know, it's something that that I think all of us who had a hand in early versions of Games Workshop games, you just pass it on.
Yeah.
It's not yours.
Yeah.
It's Games Workshop's.
It's the same with Thomas and Mordheim. You know, he's still very active in the community, but ultimately, you know, Games Workshop kind of owns the IP. And
Absolutely.
yeah.
You just hope when they do a new edition, they say thanks to the original creators and blah,
sure.
blah, blah.
Yeah.
Which happens about half the time in my experience.
Yeah, absolutely. It doesn't necessarily always come up. But no. So I don't feel like it's it's my game. It's something that I helped create, but I didn't do it alone. And I think that's an important point. I think that's probably come across in this conversation. That this is that you work collaboratively. The good stuff that comes out is almost always collaborative work where lots of different people put in, they all start singing from the same hymn sheet, as it were. They're on the same wavelength, and you're sparking off of each other, and you get something that no one person on their own could have achieved.
Yeah.
You need all of those other people adding their contribution to it.
But also Games Workshop itself, and particularly I think the Nottingham Games Workshop, the original London one was similar, was well, that's a good idea, do it.
Yeah, that's very true.
Well, no one else is going to do it, so there you go, have a go. And being given permission and a few cheap resources, occasionally a computer and a table to sit at, we made the most extraordinary things. It was very much a let's do the show right here from these few scant bits of scenery kind of approach to things. But if they worked, we did more of them. If they didn't work, we moved on.
Yeah, they're quite forgot about them. Yeah,
and it was fun because we were making it up as we went along. It was also fairly traumatizing for some folks, I think, at worst, or certainly interesting times to live in because we were setting out and there was no path ahead of us. It was just seeing where our passions led from Stephen, Ian and Brian down.
Yeah.
And 3 cheers for them for saying, go on then.
Yeah.
See if you can make it happen.
Yeah, and I think that's the biggest difference from the Games Workshop of back then, of the kind of late 80s when these games were done. Effectively, there was very little supervision or oversight. It didn't need to be. Games Workshop was a tiny company, and there wasn't enough staff to oversee and supervise us. Really, we just had to be let go and do things, and we were and I think Death Zone's a really good example of that. Actually, it meant that what we could do is from like a standing start say, okay, in 6 months' time we're going to have an expansion for Blood Bowl in the shops. So we've got to write it this month. Get it edited, laid out, and off to the printers in month 4 or whatever it would be, and then back and distributed in month 6.
And you look at what's in it; it's everything from Thrud to zombies to werewolves to Slan, whatever.
We're just throwing whatever we can in
Indeed.
there. And nowadays, Workshop, it would take 6 months just to get general approval.
Strategic documents and sales
lots of
projections.
meetings.
Which it's a different type.
And that's right, because it's a much bigger deal for Workshop now, bringing out a game. It's there are lots of people.
Which again is wonderful that it is still there and it's still part of the landscape.
Yeah, for sure.
Perhaps in the face of that.
Yeah.
So I think you did quite well there, mate. I think.
Well, we did. I think it was. Let's say it wasn't. It was just. I think it was in the zeitgeist a bit.
Yeah.
Yeah, and we latched onto that, and then we worked it through together.